This is too easy.
She really thinks someone is going to save her. Nobody's coming for you.
San Francisco, California, autumn 2023. It was a cold night, typical for the city. One of those nights when no one imagines that something extraordinary is about to happen. On a quiet street, an old house seemed completely abandoned. Inside, an elderly woman in a wheelchair, forgotten by her own children, did the only thing she had left: pray in silence. What no one could have imagined is that on that very night, an American gang would choose that exact house as their target, and even more improbable, that prayer would change everything. Today, you're going to hear a story that doesn't appear in the news, a story that hasn't been explained by the police, an event that defies human logic. And when you get to the end of this video, you'll understand why nobody managed to leave that house the same way they went in. Hello, welcome to this channel, where we tell untold stories about Jesus, accounts that defy reason, confront fear, and reveal what happens when someone cries out for help at their breaking point. Before we begin, I want to invite you to participate in this moment. Write Amen in the comments. Tell us where you are listening from and the exact time now. This is very important. And if this story touches you in any way, leave a like. That way you help this account reach more people who may also need hope. Now, take a deep breath, because what happened in that house in San Francisco, nobody would believe if there weren't witnesses. San Francisco, California, late autumn. The cold wind from the bay swept through the narrow streets of the Bayview neighborhood, carrying with it the distant sound of sirens, buses, and the hurried footsteps of a city that never stops, except for that house. It was an old, single-story house, its beige paint peeling, its windows closed for days. To someone passing by quickly, it seemed empty. To someone observing carefully, it was simply forgotten. The front garden was overflowing with dry leaves, the mailbox overflowing with old letters, overdue bills, and pamphlets yellowed with age. Margaret Hill, 78 years old, lived there. Margaret had been in a wheelchair for almost 6 years, ever since a stroke took away some of her mobility and almost all of her children's presence in her life. She had two. One lived in Nevada, the other in Los Angeles. At first they called, then they texted. Finally, nothing. Margaret's routine became silence, interrupted only by the creaking of the wheelchair on the wooden floor and the old clock hanging on the living room wall. She survived on a modest pension, a little government assistance, and the occasional kindness of a neighbor who sometimes left groceries at her door. She didn't complain, she didn't curse, but she also didn't pretend it didn't hurt. On that particular night, Margaret sensed something different in the air. The sky was darker than usual. The wind battered against the windows, and for some reason, her heart seemed restless. She turned off the television early, something she rarely did, and stared at an old photograph on the dresser, her late husband, and their two young children smiling on the beach. "Where did I go wrong, my God?" he murmured. On the other side of town, 4 men were watching that same house. They didn't know her. They didn't know Margaret's name. To them, she was just a perfect target. The gang had formed in the forgotten alleys and streets of the city. They weren't newcomers. They had already broken into cars, small shops, empty houses, and that house had everything they were looking for: an abandoned appearance, no visible cameras, no dogs, no constant movement. "That one's dead inside," said one of them, leaning against a black car parked half a block away. "If there's anyone around, they're too old to react." Another laughed. Even better, they didn't see a person. They saw an opportunity. The plan was simple: go in, grab electronics, money, anything sellable, and get out in under 10 minutes. They'd done it dozens of times before. It never failed. Meanwhile, inside the house, Margaret was trying to get ready for bed. She put a thin blanket over her legs, turned off the living room light, and left only a bedside lamp on in the bedroom. Silence reigned once more, until a dry thud echoed from outside. She froze. Another noise, now closer, like metal hitting glass. Her heart began to beat erratically. Margaret tried to convince herself it was just the wind, but then she heard something that left no doubt. Footsteps, slow, careful, outside the house. "Jesus," she whispered, her voice trembling. She tried to reach for the landline phone on the table, but her hand hand failed her. The phone fell to the floor with a sound far too loud for her liking. Outside, the footsteps stopped. The silence grew heavy. Margaret felt fear burning in her chest. She had no strength to run. She had nowhere to hide. She had no one to call. That's when he did the only thing he still knew how to do. She clasped her hands together, resting them on her lap, closed her eyes, and began to pray. It wasn't a beautiful prayer. It wasn't long. It wasn't rehearsed. Jesus, I am alone. I have no one else. If this is my last night, please stay with me. Don't leave me to face this alone. Outside, the back window was forced open. A sharp crack cut through the night. One of the men smiled. We went in. They didn't know that, at that instant, something invisible had changed inside that house. Margaret continued praying, now silently, while tears streamed down her wrinkled face. She wasn't asking for revenge. She wasn't asking for punishment. She was only asking for protection. The first man stepped into the kitchen. The second followed right behind. The third kept watch. The fourth kept the car running. Everything seemed normal, easy, quiet, but without understanding why, the man who entered first felt a shiver run down his spine. He stopped for a second, looked around, and had the strange feeling of not being alone. Hurry up, whispered the other. They moved forward. Margaret heard the sound inside the house now. There was no longer any doubt. Her body trembled. Her heart felt like it was about to leap out of her chest. Still, she continued praying, and it was at that moment, exactly at that moment, that something began to happen. Something none of them could explain later. Something that wasn't in the gang's plans. Something that would transform that forgotten house into the center of a story no one would believe if there weren't witnesses. The first man carefully walked through the kitchen, holding his cell phone flashlight at chest height. The beam of light cut through the darkness and revealed simple details. An old sink, washed and organized dishes, a folded cloth on the stove. Nothing luxurious, no expensive electronics. That already bothered him. This house doesn't look like it's going to yield much, he muttered. Relax, replied the second, opening a drawer. There's always money hidden away. Old people save everything. They didn't know that the old woman was just a few meters away, motionless in her wheelchair, her eyes closed and her lips moving in a silent prayer. Margaret was breathing heavily. Every sound seemed amplified. The slight creaking of the floorboards, the metallic click of a drawer being opened, the friction of shoes against the floor. Her body wanted to react, but it wouldn't. The only thing she could control was her mind and her faith. Jesus, please. The hallway connecting the kitchen to the living room was narrow. The walls bore the marks of time. Old paintings, family photos, a simple crucifix hanging crookedly. When the flashlight beam passed over it, the first man looked away, unsure why. A strange unease gripped his chest. Dude, he whispered, let's go and leave. Are you scared now? The other mocked. Come on. They followed. In the room, they found a worn-out sofa, an old television, and simple furniture. Nothing that justified the risk. One of them lightly kicked a box next to the bookcase. That's a waste of time. At that exact moment, Margaret heard the closest sound she had ever heard before. They were in the living room, just a few feet from the bedroom. She sensed something different in the air. It wasn't noise, it wasn't wind. It was as if the environment had changed. The fear was still there, but something began to mingle with it. A strange feeling of calm, almost like an invisible embrace. Margaret opened her eyes slowly. I know the Lord is here, she thought. In the hallway, the first man stopped suddenly. His whole body stiffened. The second man almost bumped into him. What is it now? Did you feel that? The first one asked, his voice too low. What did you feel? He didn't know how to answer. He only had a clear feeling that someone was watching them. Not from the shadows, not from behind doors, but from everywhere at once. There's someone in this house, he said. Of course there is, the other replied. Let's get this over with quickly. They moved forward down the corridor. Margaret heard them stop in front of the bedroom door. Her breath caught in her throat. Her hands were sweating. Her heart felt like it was going to burst out of her chest. The doorknob turned slowly. The door opened with a slight creak. The flashlight beam revealed Margaret sitting in the wheelchair, small, frail, her eyes brimming with tears. She didn't scream. She didn't plead. She just looked at them. For a second that seemed like an eternity. Nobody moved. The first man felt his stomach churn. This scene was not what he had expected. There was no confrontation. There was no resistance. Just a defenseless woman, alone. Oh my God. It slipped out of her mouth without her realizing it. The second one frowned. Damn. Margaret was the first to speak. Her voice was weak, but firm. I have nothing for you. Silence. But if you want, you can take whatever you need. Just don't hurt me. She didn't look at them with hatred, nor with anger. She She looked at them like someone who had already lost too much to still feel resentment. The second man looked away. The first one couldn't. That's when something happened. The room's temperature seemed to have changed. The air became heavy, dense. The flashlight flickered for a second and almost fell from the man's hand. He felt a deep shiver, unlike any fear he had ever experienced. It wasn't panic. It was reverence. You were praying?" he asked, without knowing why. Margaret nodded slowly. "I was asking for help." The second one laughed nervously. "Help from whom?" She didn't answer immediately. She just closed her eyes for a moment and said, "From Jesus." The name echoed in the room, as if it had its own weight. The second man took a step back. "That's enough," he said, trying to sound firm. "Let's grab something and leave." But the first one didn't move. He felt something pressing on his conscience. Images began to surface in his mind without warning. His childhood, his grandmother taking him to church, a Bible forgotten in a drawer, broken promises, wrong choices. "We should go out," he said, his voice trembling. "Have you gone mad?" Before the discussion could continue, a loud noise echoed through the house. Coming from the living room, something fell, something heavy. They both turned around at the same time. "The watchman," murmured the second, but there was no response from the hallway. Margaret opened her eyes again. Her heart was beating fast, but that feeling of calm remained. "He's arrived," she said, almost in a whisper. "Who?" asked the first one, now visibly shaken. She didn't answer. At that moment, footsteps echoed through the house again. But they weren't the hurried steps of someone fleeing. They were slow, steady, determined, and they were coming towards the room. The second man paled. That wasn't part of the plan. The first one felt his legs give way, because somehow they both knew someone else was in that house, and it wasn't human. The footsteps were coming from the living room, slow, heavy, as if each step had its own intention. There was no hurry, but there was no hesitation either. It was the kind of sound that didn't match fear or surprise. It matched authority. The second man instinctively reached for his waist, where he usually carried a gun. His fingers trembled as they touched the cold metal. "Stop it," he whispered, more to himself than to the others. "It's just the guard. He must have knocked something over." But his voice didn't convince even himself. The first man remained motionless, staring at Margaret. The woman now kept her eyes closed again, her lips moving silently. There was something deeply disturbing about that image. While two armed criminals trembled, she seemed at peace. "Madam," he said, almost pleading, "well, what's happening?" Margaret took a deep breath before answering. "I don't know how to explain it," she said sincerely, "but I know when he is near." The footsteps stopped outside the room. The silence that followed was worse than any noise, a dense silence that pressed on his ears and chest. The second man felt cold sweat trickle down his back. His mind screamed to run, but his body seemed too heavy to obey. "Is anyone there?" he shouted, trying to regain control. No response. At that very moment outside the house, something even stranger was happening. The fourth man, the driver, was in the car, the engine running, nervously glancing around. He hated this role. He always had. Waiting, not knowing what was happening inside, was worse than going in. Then he saw. At first he thought it was a reflection from the streetlight. He blinked. He looked again. The front door of the house was open. "That wasn't part of the plan," he murmured. He picked up his cell phone to call the security guard, but the call went straight to voicemail. He tried again. Nothing. That's when she felt something different. He heard no footsteps. He saw no one approaching. But he had a clear feeling that he was no longer alone inside the car. His heart raced. He turned his head quickly toward the passenger seat. Empty. Even so, the air seemed occupied. "Stop it," she said aloud, trying to laugh. "It's just nerves." But when he looked in the rearview mirror, his blood ran cold. For a second, just one, he was absolutely certain that someone was back there, in the back seat. He couldn't see a face. He couldn't make out a shape. He just felt it, a presence. He jumped out of the car in a panic, leaving the door open and the engine running. He ran a few steps along the sidewalk, but something made him stop. It wasn't physical strength. It was as if his feet simply wouldn't obey him anymore. "I need to get out of here," she shouted, her voice cracking. Inside the house, the two men in the room heard a distant scream coming from the street. "It's him," said the second. "Something went wrong." The footsteps echoed again, now inside the hallway, moving away from the room, as if whoever was there had changed direction. "He went outside," whispered the first one. Margaret opened her eyes. "No," she corrected gently. "He's everywhere." The first man felt his legs give way. He sat down on the floor without realizing it, leaning his back against the wall. His mind was spinning. Everything he knew about control, strength, and power was being dismantled right there, second by second. second. And that's not possible, he murmured. Not everything needs to be possible to be real, Margaret replied. In the room, the guard was lying on the floor. Not injured, not unconscious, just unable to move. He was conscious. He knew where he was. He knew who he was, but his body wouldn't respond. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. He tried to raise his arm, but nothing happened. And then he felt it. Not hands, not weight, but something that enveloped him from within, as if every thought were being observed, every memory exposed, every mistake brought to light without judgment, only truth. Tears began to well up in the corners of her eyes. Inside the room, the second man finally lost control. "That's enough," he shouted. "Let's go now." He tried to run toward the door, but the moment he took his first step, he tripped, not on anything visible, but as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. He fell to his knees, breathless. "I can't," he said, terrified. "I can't get up." The first man was now weeping openly, not just from fear, but from something deeper, regret, guilt, shame. "We shouldn't be here," she repeated. "We should never be." Margaret watched everything with tears in her eyes, but not tears of panic, out of gratitude. "He's giving you a chance," he said, "the same chance he gave me so many times." The second man slowly raised his face. "A chance at what?" she replied without hesitation. "To leave different from how they arrived." Outside, the driver finally fell to his knees on the sidewalk, crying without understanding why. Inside the house, something was about to happen that would mark them all forever, because that wasn't the end yet. It was only the beginning of what Jesus would do that night. The second man was still kneeling on the bedroom floor, breathing unevenly. He tried to support himself with his hands to stand up, but his arms failed him as if they had no strength at all. Panic gripped his face. "Is this some kind of joke?" she shouted, her voice breaking. "What have you done to us, old woman?" Margaret stared intently, but didn't respond angrily. She simply stared at him with teary eyes. "I didn't do anything," he said calmly. "I just asked for help." The first man, still sitting on the ground, slowly raised his face. His eyes were red, swollen from crying. He no longer looked like the same man who had entered minutes before with arrogance and confidence. Now he seemed small, fragile, lost. We just wanted to grab a few things," he murmured. "We didn't mean to hurt anyone." Margaret closed her eyes for a moment. "But you chose to enter the house of someone who couldn't defend themselves." The sentence landed like a heavy weight on us. In the hallway, silence reigned once more. Not a single footstep, not a single sound. Yet the feeling of presence remained, firm, constant, impossible to ignore. The second man finally managed to stand, leaning against the wall. He staggered to the bedroom door and looked down the dark hallway. "Let's go now," he said, trying to sound firm. "Now." He went ahead first. The hallway seemed longer than before. The walls seemed to close in slightly, as if the house were breathing. Each step required effort. The second man began to sweat profusely. "Why is it so difficult to walk?" he grumbled. The first one followed him, still trembling. He looked back for a second at Margaret, who remained in the room. "Madam," he began. "Go," she said sweetly, "but go with sincerity in your hearts." They didn't fully understand, but they didn't argue. In the room, they found the guard still on the floor, his eyes wide, breathing rapidly, tears streaming down his face. When he saw the two of them, he tried to speak, but only a muffled sound escaped his throat. "Get up," ordered the second one, pulling him by the arm. "Nothing." "He can't," said the first, feeling a lump in his throat. "Then leave it alone," shouted the other desperately. "I'm not staying here because of this." They ran to the front door. The latch turned. The door didn't open. "No, no!" The second man forced again, now violently. "Open up!" Nothing. The first one tried the back door. Locked. Windows. Real estate. "This isn't normal," she said, her voice faltering. "None of this is normal." That's when they heard the most terrifying sound of the night. A whisper, not coming from any specific place. It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive, but it permeated everything. Not clear words, but a feeling that translated into meaning. Better. The three men froze. The second one fell to his knees again, now sobbing. "I can't take it anymore," she cried. "I'll do whatever you want, just make it stop." The first one closed his eyes tightly. Images flashed through his mind in rapid succession. His mother crying when he left home, his first theft, the first time he ignored his own conscience. "We messed up," she said aloud, almost as a confession. "We messed up badly." The guard, still on the ground, finally managed to speak, his voice weak and broken. "I saw." The others turned around. "Saw someone?" "Who?" asked the first one. "I don't know how to explain it," he replied, trembling. "But it wasn't like us. He was standing still, and yet everywhere." Silence returned. Then, slowly, the pressure began to decrease. The air became lighter. The men were able to breathe with less difficulty. In the room, Margaret felt it too. She put her hand to her chest and wept silently. "Thank you, Jesus," she whispered. In the room, the men understood something they had never considered before. They weren't imprisoned because someone was attacking them. They were imprisoned because they needed to make a decision. The first one was the only one who had the courage to speak. "If we leave here," he swallowed hard, "I'll never be the same again." The second one didn't answer. He just nodded, defeated. At that moment, the latch on the front door turned by itself. The door opened slowly, creaking. The cold night wind entered the house. They looked at each other, terrified. The way out was right there, but none of them moved, because now they knew. Leaving that house meant carrying that night with them for the rest of their lives. And he still had to face Margaret one last time. The front door remained open, swaying slightly in the cold morning wind. The street was empty. No sirens, no neighbors in sight. It was as if the whole world had stepped away from that house to watch, in silence, what still needed to happen. The three men stood still for a few seconds that seemed like minutes. "Let's go now," said the second, his voice weak, more out of instinct than conviction. But nobody moved. The first man took a deep breath and, against all the logic that had always guided his life, turned and began to walk back down the corridor. His steps were slow, heavy, not out of fear, but out of awareness. "What are you doing?" asked the second one, startled. "I need to look at her," he replied, "before I leave." The guard, still trembling, finally managed to stand up with the help of the wall. His movements were clumsy, as if his body were relearning how to obey. He didn't argue. He just kept going. In the room, Margaret remained in the same position. The light from the lamp cast soft shadows on the walls. When she saw them return, her heart tightened for a moment, not from fear, but from uncertainty. "You're still here," he said in a low voice. The first man stopped a few steps from her. He slowly pulled back his hood, revealing a face too young to bear so much weight in his eyes. He ran a hand over his face, took a deep breath, and then did something he had never done in an invasion. He lowered his head. "Ma'am," he began, but his voice cracked. He tried again. "I'm sorry." The second one's eyes widened. The guard began to cry silently. Margaret felt the tears welling up again, but she didn't respond immediately. "We came to steal," the man continued, his voice breaking, "because we thought nobody cared about this house. We thought nobody cared about you, ma'am." He swallowed hard. "And maybe nobody even cares." Margaret took a deep breath. "My children don't mind," she said honestly, "but that doesn't mean I'm alone." The second man stepped forward. "Did they abandon you?" she asked, almost without realizing it. She nodded slowly. "When I was in a wheelchair, everything became difficult. At first they came, then they stopped." He paused. "But Jesus never stopped." The name filled the room again. The watchman fell to his knees, unable to contain himself. "I felt it," she said, crying. "I felt everything, my whole life, flashing before my eyes. I've never felt this before." Margaret looked at him tenderly. "Because when we can no longer run from who we are, he finds us." The first man was now breathing with difficulty. His whole body was trembling. "Why didn't he hurt us?" she asked. "We deserved it." Margaret leaned slightly forward in her chair. "Because he did not come to destroy you." Pause. "He came to stop you." The silence that followed was no longer heavy. It was profound. The second man wiped his face with his coat sleeves. "The lady needs help," he said. "This house, this place, I know," she replied. "But help that comes from fear doesn't last." The first man knelt down, not out of obligation, not out of desperation, out of recognition. "If we leave here," she said, her voice breaking, "what do you want us to do?" Margaret closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, there was a firm serenity in her gaze. "Don't go back to being who you were when you came in." He took a deep breath. "And don't let anyone else think that a weak person is invisible." Outside, the wind suddenly stopped. The house fell into absolute silence. Something had been sealed there. The first man stood up slowly. The second did the same. The watchman wiped away his tears and took a deep breath, like someone returning to the surface after nearly drowning. "We're leaving now," said the first one, "but you won't be forgotten." Margaret felt her heart clench. "Promises are easy," he said. "Lives changed, not so much." They nodded. When they left the room, neither of them looked back, not out of indifference, but out of respect. At the front door, before crossing the property line, the first man stopped. For a brief moment, a very brief one, he had the strange certainty that someone was there, between them and the street. He saw nothing, but she smiled, crying. "Thank you," he whispered, and then they left. Margaret was alone again, but not empty, because that night something had changed not only for them, but also go for her. The following days passed far too slowly for Margaret Hill. The morning after the break-in arrived silently, as if the previous night had been just a dark dream. The sun streamed through the living room window, illuminating particles of dust in the air. The house was intact. Nothing had been taken, no furniture had been broken, no object had been touched. Still, Margaret knew it had been real. Her body felt the emotional exhaustion, but her spirit was strong. She spent the entire morning sitting by the window, watching the street. Each passing car made her heart race for a second, not from fear, but from anticipation. "The Lord knows what he's doing," he murmured. On the third day, the neighbor who usually helped showed up earlier than usual. He knocked on the door twice before going inside. "Margaret," she called. "Are you all right?" Margaret smiled. "I am. May." The neighbor found the tone too serene for someone who had lived alone for so long. "I saw you at the window yesterday. You looked different." Margaret didn't explain. Not yet. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, the four men were also unable to continue their lives as before. The first one, the one who had taken off his hood in the room, couldn't sleep properly. Every time he closed his eyes, he relived the scene in the wheelchair, the calm in the old woman's eyes, the feeling of being seen in his entirety. He tried going out, drinking, distracting himself. Nothing worked. On the fourth day, he went alone into a small, almost empty church. He sat in the last pew and cried as he hadn't cried since he was a child. The second man distanced himself from the group. He stopped answering calls. He began wandering aimlessly through the city, avoiding the alleys he once knew so well. Every time he saw an elderly person on the street, something ached inside him. The security guard was the one who changed the most. He quit his informal job and started helping out at a community center without knowing exactly why. He just felt he needed to do something that wasn't destructive. And the driver, he never got back into that car the same way. He sold the vehicle a week later. But it was on the sixth day that something unexpected happened. Margaret was alone in the room, praying silently, when she heard knocking at the front door. 3 firm taps. She froze for a moment. Her heart raced. She took a deep breath. "Whatever happens, the Lord is with me," he whispered. She pushed the wheelchair slowly to the door and opened it. They were on the other side. The same men. No hoods, no threatening posture, no arrogance. The first man was holding 2 grocery bags. The second had a box in his hands. The security guard had his eyes downcast, visibly nervous. "Madam," the first one began, swallowing hard. "We didn't come here to do any harm." Margaret watched them silently for a few seconds. "I know," he replied. They seemed surprised. "How?" asked the second one. "Because those who come in to hurt don't come back the same way." The first one stepped forward and put the bags on the ground. "We brought food, medicine, things you might need." Pause. And he took a deep breath. "We called social services. They're coming tomorrow." Margaret brought her hand to her mouth, overcome with emotion. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. The watchman finally raised his eyes. "Because we couldn't move on, as if nothing had happened." She took a deep breath. "And because someone who had nothing gave us everything that night." Silence fell over the balcony. Margaret felt the tears slowly streaming down her face. "Come in," he said. They entered cautiously, as if treading on sacred ground. They sat on the sofa. They talked. They listened. For the first time, they didn't take anything. They only offered. Before they left, the first man turned to Margaret. "You said we needed to go out differently." Pause. "I think we're trying." Margaret smiled. "Trying is already more than many do." When they left, Margaret remained staring at the closed door for a long time. She knew that something even bigger was yet to come. Because what Jesus had done that night was not just preventing a crime. It was about rebuilding destinies. And the ending was yet to come. The morning after the unexpected visit, Margaret Hill woke before sunrise. She hadn't slept much, not out of fear, but because her heart seemed too awake to rest. She sat in her wheelchair, gazing out the living room window as the city slowly began to come alive. At precisely 9 o'clock, as promised, 2 cars stopped in front of the house. One of them bore the seal of the county's social services, the other a police car. Margaret felt her stomach tighten. "Everything's fine," she told herself. Nothing was hidden. The knock on the door was polite, formal. When she opened the door, she found a social worker, a police officer, and a few steps behind, the 4 men. No handcuffs, no sirens, no tension. The first man stepped forward. "We went to the police station," he said, his voice firm. "We told them everything." The police officer confirmed with a nod. "They reported an attempted theft that was not completed," he explained, "and something else unusual." Margaret didn't answer. She simply invited them in. They all sat down in the room. calm. The social worker began asking practical questions: housing conditions, health, family, basic needs. Margaret answered everything calmly. For the first time in years, someone was really listening. Then the policeman cleared his throat. "Mrs. Hill," he said carefully, "these men claim they tried to break into your house, but they also claim that they were prevented from continuing by something they can't explain." There was a brief, awkward silence. "They said the lady was praying," the policeman continued, "and that something made them stop." Margaret looked up. "That is true." The police officer didn't smile. He didn't laugh. He just nodded slowly. "I've been in the police force for 22 years, he said. "I've seen a lot, and I've learned that not everything needs a report to be real." The four men stood up almost simultaneously. The first one spoke for everyone. "We don't want easy forgiveness." Pause. "But we do want to change." The police officer explained that, given the voluntary confession, the absence of harm, and the full cooperation, the case would be referred as an alternative measure: community service, psychological counseling, and monitoring. No arrest at that time. "That was the system's decision," he concluded. "But the system isn't always what changes people." The social worker turned to Margaret. "You will be included in a comprehensive assistance program," he smiled. "And your children have been notified." Margaret felt her heart race. He hesitated. "Did they answer?" "One of them is coming this afternoon," the assistant replied. The world seemed to spin for a moment. Hours later, the house was packed like it hadn't been in years. Technicians assessed the adaptations. Volunteers brought new furniture. The neighbor helped in the kitchen. And in the midst of it all, Margaret observed in silence, as if she were watching a movie she never imagined she would be in. In the late afternoon, a car parked in front of the house. A man got off the bus. He was their eldest son. He entered slowly, unsure where to look. When he saw his mother in the wheelchair, his eyes filled with tears. "Mother," she said, her voice breaking. "Forgive me." Margaret didn't answer immediately. She just opened her arms. He knelt before her. Outside, the four men watched from a distance. None of them said anything. They knew that this scene was also part of what they had experienced. Before they left, the first man approached Margaret once more. "You changed our lives." She shook her head. "It wasn't me." Pause. "It was him." That night, when the house finally fell silent, Margaret turned off the lights and left only the bedside lamp on, as she always did. But this time, she didn't feel forgotten. Before closing her eyes, she whispered, "Thank you for staying with me when no one else would." And for a brief moment, so brief it couldn't be proven, the atmosphere seemed warmer, lighter, as if someone were still there, not to scare, not to punish, but to take care of. That's how that attempted theft became a story that circulated among social workers, police officers, and volunteers in San Francisco. No one has ever been able to fully explain what happened in that house. But everyone agreed on one thing. That night, an elderly woman in a wheelchair wasn't protected by force. She was protected by presence.